Welcome, one and all, sisters, brothers, fathers, mothers, to another one of my special wizard tales.
Puss in Boots. Many years ago, in a faraway place, the evil Count Yorick ruled over his terrified people. The Count had magical powers, and some even whispered that he danced with the devil. Close by the Count's castle was a flour mill run by a kindly old man and his 3 sons, Carabas, Henry, and John. Apart from each other, all they had was a cow and a clever cat called Puss. One day, the Count burst into the mill and demanded to see the old miller. But Carabas sadly told the Count it was too late, for the miller had just died.
How dare he die? He didn't have my permission,
growled the cruel Count. When Carabas complained that the Count had worked their father to death, the evil Yorick threatened to turn him into a plant. Count Yorick then ordered 4 dozen loaves to be baked for King Leonard, who was greedy and loved the bread from the mill. When John complained, Yorick magically grew another head, and both of his heads threatened the miller's sons. The 3 men knew they could do nothing to fight the Count's terrible magic. As he left the mill, the Count boasted of his magical powers.
I can do anything I want. I could even make that cat of yours talk if I wanted to. Just like that.
And that's just what he did. Not that Carabas, John, and Henry believed it, of course. After all, Puss didn't actually say anything. And besides, who ever heard of a talking cat? Puss belonged to Carabas, but Carabas was young and foolish and didn't care. In fact, that night, Carabas said he was leaving them all and was off to seek his fortune. John and Henry tried to talk Carabas out of his plan because they knew the Count would find him and kill him. But Carabas didn't care. He was going, and he didn't need their help. He didn't even need a cat. But Puss had other ideas. Carabas said his goodbyes and left the mill. Puss followed a few minutes later.
We'll soon see who needs a cat or not, my young master,
said Puss to himself. The only way for Carabas to cross the stream near the mill was by walking across an old fallen log. Unfortunately, the log was rotten. It snapped, and Carabas fell into the fast-flowing stream. Carabas knew the current was pushing him towards the Count's castle and certain death. Luckily, Puss knew what to do. He raced ahead and pushed down a branch overhanging the stream. As he floated past, Carabas grabbed the branch and dragged himself to safety. The next morning, exhausted, Carabas woke up, saw the stream, and remembered what had happened. He told himself he must be the luckiest man alive. But then a voice said,
I saved your life, you know. Luck had nothing to do with it.
It was Puss, and Carabas was amazed. A talking cat? It wasn't possible. But there it was, right before him. Puss calmed Carabas down and then told him he was in danger. Carabas had floated onto the Count's land and would be killed if he was discovered. Carabas didn't know what to do, but Puss had a plan. First, Puss asked Carabas to give him his boots and knapsack. Next, Puss moved them to safer ground. And finally, he set up a trap to catch a rabbit. Young Carabas didn't know what was going on. Soon, the clever Puss did catch a rabbit. Carabas was impressed. He thought the rabbit would be their dinner, but Puss had bigger plans. He was going to give the rabbit to King Leonard himself. Carabas thought it would be impossible for Puss to get past the palace gates, but Puss was confident. He knew a talking cat could go just about anywhere. When Carabas asked why Puss was going to visit the king, Puss patiently replied,
All in good time, dear master. Wish me luck. Meow.
and he skipped off carrying the rabbit. Puss knew Count Yorick sent a carriage loaded with gifts to the king every week. When that carriage rattled past, Puss quietly jumped inside. The carriage stopped at the gates, and the palace footman asked to see the king's taxes. The driver of the carriage, who was Count Yorick's servant, showed the footman a small sack of gold.
All right, give it to me.
Snapped the greedy footman. When the footman grabbed the sack, he snatched out 2 pieces of gold for himself and 1 for the carriage driver. Hidden from view inside the carriage, but watching with great interest, was Puss in Boots. Meanwhile, Carabas had built a fire and was trying to keep his feet warm. So he was surprised and a little embarrassed when a beautiful young woman rode up to him.
I say, young man, where are your boots? You'll get blisters walking around like that.
She said. The young lady was Princess Lilani, the daughter of King Leonard, but Carabas didn't know that. The princess asked Carabas if he had seen her dog. He was a brown spaniel, and a very intelligent one too, but he'd gone missing, and she was trying to find him. When Carabas said he had not seen her dog, Princess Lilani thanked him and rode away. At the palace, clever Puss found it easy to trick the greedy footman, and he snuck inside. As usual, the king was stuffing himself with food. He had just eaten a whole cow as a snack, and was now looking forward to his lunch. What the king didn't expect to see was a cat in his throne room, particularly a talking cat. At first, the king couldn't believe a cat could actually talk. But when Puss offered the king a gift of a rabbit to eat, he changed his mind.
Oh, now you're talking,
Cried the hungry king. Puss in Boots told the king the gift was from his master, the Duke of Carabas. The king was intrigued. He'd never heard of this duke. Back at the flour mill, Count Yorick had just discovered Carabas was missing, and he was furious.
Where is he?
The vicious count cried. Carabas's brothers, John and Henry, pretended they had no idea, but Yorick used his magic to scare them. First, he turned himself into a giant wolf and threatened to eat them. Then, he turned into a giant elephant and threatened to squeeze them with his trunk. And finally, he turned into a giant snake and threatened to poison them with his bite. The brothers were terrified and admitted that Carabas had run away. Yorick was furious and vowed to kill young Carabas. That night, King Leonard and Princess Lilani enjoyed a delightful dinner, courtesy of Puss in Boots.
Father, that was the most delicious rabbit I've eaten. Where did it come from?
Asked the princess. The king was a little embarrassed to admit that the rabbit had been given to him by a talking cat who wore a pair of boots. Of course, his daughter didn't believe him. But Lilani was intrigued when her father told her the talking cat belonged to a Duke of Carabas. The princess had met a young man named Carabas that very day, and he wasn't wearing boots. The father and daughter puzzled over this coincidence. Puss in Boots made his way back to Carabas in the forest and told him of his meeting with the king. In fact, Puss was certain that the king had the rabbit for lunch last night. Carabas was confused. Lunch? Last night? How could that be? Puss explained that the king seemed to like eating lunch for breakfast, lunch for morning tea, lunch for lunch, and lunch for dinner as well. But Carabas was still confused, for he didn't know why Puss in Boots had given the king a rabbit in the first place. What was this crazy cat up to?
My plan's going perfectly. You'll be rich before you know it. Just one more week,
said the cunning Puss. A week passed, and it was time for Count Yorick's carriage loaded with gifts to drive to the palace. Carabas managed to stop the carriage, and Puss in Boots cunningly trapped the servant who was driving. Leaving Carabas to guard the driver, the clever Puss hopped onto the carriage and drove it to the castle.
Not you again? Where's the usual driver?
Asked the greedy footman. Puss in Boots told the footman that the usual driver was in prison for stealing the king's gold, and that's where the footman would end up too, if he didn't keep his mouth shut. Just then, the king heard Puss and rushed outside to see what treats the cat had brought him. The king was very impressed when Puss in Boots explained that the carriage full of gifts was from his master, the Duke of Carabas. Of course, the footman knew this was a lie, but he couldn't say anything for fear of Puss revealing he was a thief. The sack of gold that Puss in Boots gave him especially impressed the king. In fact, the king thought it would be a very good idea to meet this Duke of Carabas. Puss agreed and invited the king to lunch at the Duke of Carabas's castle the next day.
Lunch, my word. My favorite word.
Laughed the greedy king. Back in the forest, Puss in Boots set Yorick's servant free. Puss ordered the servant to return to his master and tell him everything was fine and that the king loved his gifts. The servant knew he had to agree, because if he did not, Puss would tell Yorick about the time he saw the driver stealing Yorick's gold. When the servant had gone, Puss broke the news to Carabas that he was entertaining the king for lunch in his castle. Naturally, Carabas was confused.
I haven't got a castle. I haven't even got lunch.
He cried. Meanwhile, the royal courtiers had noticed that Count Yorick was late with his carriage full of gifts for King Leonard. Of course, this was because Puss in Boots had pretended the gifts were from the Duke of Carabas. When the courtiers warned His Majesty that such a lack of gifts from Count Yorick could mean no food for him, King Leonard became very concerned.
We should pay a visit to the Count tomorrow. He can pay us on the spot,
commanded the king. But the courtiers were scared. They knew Count Yorick had a terrible reputation and could perform evil magic. But Leonard had no fear. After all, he was king. When he heard that the king was going to visit, Count Yorick was suspicious. But when he heard that the king was to be accompanied by his daughter, the beautiful Princess Leilani, the count was thrilled.
I have always wanted the beautiful princess as my wife, and now I shall have her come unsuspecting into my grasp.
Crowed the evil count. In his excitement over Leilani, the count momentarily transformed himself into a horrible wild pig, which was really what he was. The count ordered his servant to prepare a banquet fit for a king and a princess. The next morning, the royal carriage set off from the palace and drove through the forest. As soon as Puss saw the carriage coming, he asked Carabas to do a very strange thing.
Quick, master. Take off your clothes and jump into the lake,
ordered Puss. Naturally, Carabas was confused, but he knew Puss was clever and did as he was asked. Puss in Boots then stopped the royal carriage and told the king that the Duke of Carabas was swimming in the lake and that someone had stolen his clothes. The king was shocked and ordered one of his courtiers to give the Duke his clothes. He then offered to drive the Duke back to his castle. Puss whispered to Carabas to direct the carriage to the back door of Count Yorick's castle. Once again, Carabas didn't really know what was going on, but he trusted Puss and did as he was asked. So the king, Princess Lilani, and Count Carabas headed toward the castle of the evil Count Yorick. Meanwhile, Puss in Boots found two of Yorick's poor, overworked peasants.
How would you like to work for a kinder and fairer master?
Asked Puss. They were a little surprised to hear a cat talking, but they certainly liked what he had to say. So Puss in Boots gave the peasants their instructions and then headed for the Count's castle. A little later, when the royal carriage drove by, the peasants followed their instructions. They told the king that they were the luckiest peasants in the kingdom because they belonged to the generous, kind-hearted Duke of Carabas. The king was most impressed. Meanwhile, Puss in Boots had arrived at the Count's castle. First, he tricked the servant by pretending to be Yorick, disguised as a cat. And then he tricked Yorick himself by pretending he was a messenger from the king. Puss told Yorick that the king wished to see examples of Yorick's famous magic. So, Yorick demonstrated his magic. First, he turned himself into a lion, then a vulture, then a snake, and then an elephant. But before he could do any more, Yorick's servant entered the palace. At last he recognized Puss as the cat he had seen with Carabas. When Yorick heard this, he was furious. He turned himself into a wolf and started chasing Puss in Boots.
I've got you now, cat. You can't escape me,
he growled. But clever Puss had locked himself inside the Count's treasure vault. The furious Count turned himself into a bull and tried to charge the door down, but that didn't work. Next, he turned himself into a dragon and tried to burn down the door, but that didn't work either. All the while, Puss in Boots was laughing to himself.
Nothing bigger than a mouse will get past this door.
Teased Puss in Boots. Count Yorick thought this was a very good idea, so he shrunk himself down to a tiny mouse and crawled in under the door of the vault. But it was a very bad idea for the Count, because Puss in Boots grabbed the mouse-sized Count and ate him all up. Just then, the royal carriage entered the castle and was silently welcomed by Puss in Boots. Silent, because as soon as Puss ate the Count, he found he was no longer able to talk. But it didn't seem to matter, because Carabas could still see that Puss wanted them to follow him. So Carabas, the king, and Princess Lilani followed the cat down to the castle dungeon, where Carabas made an amazing discovery.
Carabas! Carabas!
Over here! We're over here! Help!
Cried Carabas's brothers John and Henry. After Carabas freed his brothers, he decided to tell the king and princess the truth. But before he could, Yorick's servant announced that lunch was served. And for the king, lunch was more important than anything else. As the king ate his lunch, Carabas told of the evil deeds of Count Yorick and how Puss in Boots had destroyed him. The king was most impressed with the lunch and with the story. He'd never liked that strange Yorick, and he was rather fond of Carabas, the miller's son, so the king made a decision.
I am bestowing upon you the official title of the Duke of Carabas,
he proclaimed. And that wasn't all. Not only did Carabas receive a title, the king also gave him all of Yorick's lands and an offer of the hand in marriage of his daughter, the beautiful Princess Lilani. Of course, Carabas was delighted to accept. He had loved the princess from the first moment he saw her. And so they married and lived happily ever after. Carabas, Lilani, and the cleverest cat in the whole world, Puss in Boots.
And thus another fine wizard tale concludes. Sisters, brothers, fathers, mothers, join me again soon for another classic tale. Won't you?